Richard Feynman was a famous physicist and professor, most no most notably achieving recognition for his Nobel Prize winning theories, but and his involvement in the Manhattan Project. But what made Richard Feynman stand out for the rest of his great contemporary physicists was his ability to explain things in the most basic and profound sense to literally anyone. I recently came across a YouTube video where a YouTube channel took a professional in his field, say like a professor, and made him explain his uh, field of work to five different people or four different people. And he made YouTube channel made the per, uh, professional explain it to a child all the way up to his colleagues. I thought this was really cool because it showed that he really masters and truly understands this topic. Because he's able to explain it to a 5-year-old who barely understands any complex English or and is barely able to string like complex sentences together, but he's able to explain it to such a young child, and the child is able to understand it. So when I watched this video, I thought of the Richard Feynman and his infamous Feynman technique. The Feynman technique is a system of learning that splits any basic or difficult concept into 4 steps so that you can basically learn and master and revise and understand the topic. The first step is just very simply just pick a concept that you want to learn. This can range from literally anything from mathematics to science to sports, gambling, whatever. The second step is to teach this concept to a young child. Now, this step is basically saying that you take your concept and you break it down into its most basic form, and you're able to explain this to someone who barely understands English, who doesn't know the complexities of how things work and is really just understands simple basic things. If you're able to do this, you're able to understand the concept in its most fundamental sense, and that really shows that you know where the fundamental base for this concept is, and you know how you can grow this base and really understand the concept you're trying to learn. The third is identifying the gaps. Now, what identifying the gaps mean is basically you have a concept and you have another concept that's related to it, and you're able to connect it in your brain. But then you have another concept, and you know that these concepts are intertwined, but you don't know exactly why. And this questioning shows that there's gaps in your knowledge. And if you're able to connect everything together, you can understand everything in a connected sense and really understand what this concept is trying to say and how it connects to the greater sense of things. The fourth step is revising your knowledge. Now, revising your knowledge is going back to the source knowledge, understanding what your gaps were, and going back to like the source and researching what you need to know, what more stuff you need to know, like research and and what things you need to build on. It's like build on. Now, when you go back, there will obviously be things you don't understand, make you question. So then you go back to that concept and you do the process all over again. Now, the Feynman technique is something that is it's pretty funny because it's really simple. You just pick a concept, you teach it to a young child, and you basically identify what you did wrong and how you can like go back and fill in the gaps. And this really is actually a super powerful tool that I haven't used enough, but it really is something that everyone can use to basically learn anything. Now, the point of this video was just my take on the Feynman technique and how I connected active recall, the Feynman technique, and just good study tips in general, and how this can maybe be a more refined version of the Feynman technique that I use. So like Feynman technique, I could say like I'm sure this is someone has already come up with this, but this is just how I see it. So the revised version of Feynman technique that I use is that obviously the first step is the same, you pick a concept. But the second step, when you teach it to a young child, the teaching step, when you're, say, sitting down at your desk or in the library or wherever you study, there obviously won't be a young child sitting next to you. So you can't just turn to him, be like, hey, let me explain this to you. You're really most of the time by yourself when you're learning something. So how do you teach it to yourself? Well, obviously, you still want to follow the steps of the basics, really trying to explain it. If there was a child in front of you, how would you explain to this child? And obviously, children are very annoying, so they'll ask, why? Why? Why is it this way? Why is it that way? And obviously, you won't have all the answers, but you have to get to a point where you don't have the answer to it. You don't have the answer to their annoying why questions. And then you understand the gap in your knowledge. So, the teaching part, just imagine you're teaching it to yourself. So you're being the annoying child in this case, and when you learn something, you ask, why is it this way? Why is it this way? Why is it this way? And then when you don't know why is it that way, then you understand where your gap in knowledge is, and then you can maybe go back and research, why is this the case? But ultimately, you should really be teaching it to yourself. So when you go through something, you ask yourself the question, why does it work? What did I just learn? And that leads to the next step of active recall. Active recall is when you read something, you test yourself on it. You test yourself on what you just read. Say you just read from economics textbook and it's about banks, which I just did. And you ask yourself, what did I learn in this passage? And you just make a mental model of, say, the money supply, Fed, uh, inflation, and you just have a mental model of yourself. You make a mental model for yourself, so and you really test yourself on it. Make sure you understand what you read and make sure it's not you just were skimming through it and just it goes through one ear and out the other. So this is my addition to the Feynman technique. It's the idea of teaching it not to a child, but basically teaching it to yourself, and really adding the aspect of active recall to the technique. Of course, the third step is the gap in knowledge, which we identified here. And the fourth step would be to fill it. I think this is still the same. I think the most important part is that you combine these two steps. That was a terrible star. These two steps to really teach yourself why this concept is the way it is and understand what you just read or what you just put into your brain. Because when you test yourself on it and when you're actively recalling something, you're more likely to remember it because you've gone through the effort to, you know, ask yourself the questions. I think the Feynman technique really boils down to one thing, and that is questions. You just ask yourself a lot of questions because the annoying child part of the Feynman technique is just your inner voice saying, "Oh, why is this that way? Why is that way?" And most of the time, people ignore it, and most of the time people ignore it. And I sometimes ignore these questions because I just don't want to answer them. It's too much of a hassle. But it's really important to ask questions of why this concept is the way it is, because obviously people before you have come up with these ideas, and they obviously had a way of thinking of why this theory, this fact, whatever statistic, whatever it is, how they derived it and where it came from. You got to understand and ask yourself this question: where did this come from? When you ask yourself this question, where did it come from? This leads to your own understanding of a concept. When you ask yourself the question, this leads to your own understanding, not what some textbook says or some manual or something, or just not what some textbook or manual says. You have to have your own understanding of what it is, and um, this really helps you learn basically anything that you put your mind to. It all really comes down to effort. The more effort you put in, the more you understand. Now, for those who like a more visual way of seeing things, how I see the Feynman technique is just you can picture it like a map of neurons. So you pick a concept, it's just a singular neuron, right? Then you begin to learn more about this concept. So you have just lines everywhere, and say a new concept appears. That's too far away. A new concept appears here. A new concept appears here. And so this is step one of the Feynman technique. And when you learn this concept, there are things that you just understand about it, and they begin to branch out. And then it connects with another concept. So because it's oh, I can't draw this clearly. Because it's not not clearly connected at first. This is the second step of the Feynman technique. You got to understand where how these things maybe connect together, and you got to teach yourself that, because no one else is going to teach it to you. Maybe a textbook can say how you should understand it, but then you got to go through the questions, the why something works, and then actively recall it when you're reading it. When you actively recall and when you question, the bond between these two, I don't know, let's say, well, this is technically the myelin sheath or whatever, and it's not important right now, but the connection between these two neurons increases and strengthens. And when that is strengthened, it's really easy. You can think of it like a neuron. When the myelin sheath of a neuron is bigger, the connection between these two neurons is faster. Um, the electricity or whatever passes between neurons fires faster. You can think of it that way. If I'm wrong, I'm not some science nerd, but if it's like this, you can basically think about it that way. So this is step two, and then from there, more concepts, more and more concepts, and then intertwined, and then this is step two of the Feynman technique, and then it just goes on from there. It's like a web of knowledge. That's how I connected the Feynman technique to active recall, to mental models, to web of knowledge. This is how basically Feynman, I hypothesize, basically taught himself all the complicated things that he knows. Of course, there obviously is more to this, like mentoring and like things like that. But I have yet to read Feynman's book, his infamous book. But this is my take on the Feynman technique and how it basically connects to active recall, mental models, and webs of knowledge. Um, oh, I guess the third and fourth, fourth steps of the Feynman technique, forgot about those, would be to strengthen these. There might not be a connection to other innate concepts, but if you really understand where these pieces of knowledge come from and they come from this concept right here, I think that's pretty solid. So obviously the third step is to uh, find gaps, and the fourth is to revise. So overall, this is my take on the Feynman technique. Um, I don't follow this technique religiously. I do follow the teaching part of it, teaching like an active recall part of it. Um, if you found something useful in this video, uh, my goal is achieved. If you didn't, then uh, maybe you can uh, find your own way of looking at things, and that would really help you. I really hope this video was somewhat useful, and see you next time.